Joe Rabbits from Manchester University. As you say, it's a white knuckle right, and it is, I think, the main agenda for the 21st century. I've had the privilege of writing some of the papers that are in this special issue, amongst which was the paper on the low-carbon economy. And this was really an exploration of the issues relating, first of all, to the Environment Agency, who commissioned the work, but also to many other public bodies around the UK, on the implications of the call for a low-carbon economy. And I say call because this comes very much from different sections of society, but particularly from, for instance, the Minister for Energy and Climate Change, is quite a sort of driving force. And you say, yeah, low-carbon economy, it's just out there, let's go and do it. And that sounds great. And then you look at the reality, as I do in my travels around the country, and you say, well, things don't seem to be quite working. Everyone still is in their departmental boxes, and this person does economics, and that person does planning, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of inertia and misunderstanding around. And the situation is made more urgent every day almost by the headlines and the 100 months to save the world and sort of thing. But this urgency often has the wrong effect, which is to say, people freeze up and they say, well, actually, I just can't do this, I'm just going to catch it. Next flight, drive and so on. So we obviously need new forms of governance. We need new forms of information sharing on the science. We need new forms of decision making which are shared, networked, participated, and so on. All of which can be mapped out in theory, and we can look for a few shining examples. Now the question is, do you see in your many levels of government activity signs that this is really about to happen? Or are we still, not quite at the starting blocks yet, so we're still at field stage?
I suppose what I think we need is political leadership more than anything else. You need an advocate, someone with real political power, showing moral leadership, taking that long-term perspective. The problem is whether you're in the private sector or within government, you often have a short-term perspective. The politician wants to be re-elected. The private sector needs to make a profit for the shareholders the next quarter, the quarter after that. And so I think we've become a society of short-term. And we need to take for issues such as climate change or biodiversity loss or water quantity and quality a much longer-term perspective. It's clear that leadership matters. I mean, I'll use a very different example. It was clearly at the time of getting rid of apartheid in South Africa, if it hadn't been Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, the place could have erupted. They showed moral leadership of how to sort of deal with apartheid. The question is, where are those equivalent leaders taking us forward on climate change, taking us forward on biodiversity loss? Now, we have some vocal leaders who've talked about issues such as climate change. Al Gore has won when he won the Nobel Prize at the same time as IPCC. But he's actually just a citizen in the US at the moment. He is not a political leader anymore. So the question is, where are those political leaders that are willing to take the really hard decisions and move forward? Now, we have to take some credit in the UK that we have a climate change bill that argues for an 80% reduction by 2050, the first country in the world that actually has a climate change bill. It also has some teeth in it, that it has an independent climate change committee chaired by an extremely independently minded individual, Lord Adair Turner, who's really superb. And so I would say the UK can take some credit for it. I think Germany and France are showing real leadership as well. But that's not enough. We need, as I've said, I think we need technological evolution, not revolution, but certainly evolution. We need to get the right policies in place, and we have to work with the community. Individual behaviour is going to be crucial. And if we don't show leadership within the industrialised world, and that does need the US to take leadership, why would we expect, or why should we expect China and India, let alone some of the really poor countries in the world, to move forward? So I think the question is, I don't think there's anything wrong with the governance structure per se, but clearly we have not lit a fire under the private sector or the governments of the world or the individuals to make this move forward.
Thank you very much. Bill?
Just really following on from that institution, my name's Bill Watts, by the way, from
me that coming out of this is that one of the issues we do have is actually a way that we silo our policy. We silo our policy in terms of climate change, we silo our policy in terms of water quality, in terms of water quantity, air quality and the rest of it. And what that means is often we're actually optimising on single targets rather than optimising across the field. So there's a sort of point there to make. I think the next point which comes across to me is that you mentioned about the importance of the use of the price mechanism as a way of delivering ecosystem services. An example of that might well be, for instance, the use of dynamic electricity pricing, which at the moment we don't do, but which could be used to reduce the overall install capacity by, say, 20%. So it seems to me that there is actually an institutional challenge here, and that is the use of market mechanisms, use of market prices, creating mechanisms where they don't exist, and of course making sure we have the underlying science there, which allows us to actually quantify the benefits and ascribe them to the beneficiaries too. So I mean, I think there's a certain institutional stroke research and economics challenge there.
Well, the first thing is my very first slide after the one with my name on it showed climate change in the middle. I could have put food security, or I could have put biodiversity, and showed all the other environmental issues. And that is the first point: is we've got to start to look at all of these issues together to see where there are synergies on policies from one issue to another, and where there are potential trade-offs. It's not all win-win-win. There are some win-wins, but there's also some win-loses, and the key there is to understand what the trade-offs are. And in fact, I actually presented a new evidence investment strategy that I and the team have been working on at DEFRA, and presented it to our ministers. And that was my major point to Hilary Benn and the other ministers, and that is, it isn't just trying to get the evidence looking synergistically, but the policies have to. And one minister sort of said, who's got the climate change agenda, another one had biodiversity, and the third one has food, said, what you're telling me is we all need to work together. And I mean, and the answer was yes. But we are siloed. And the problem is, you can't have everything connected to everything. It is, you have to disaggregate it at some stage. But the question is working together, and that is a question. That's true for the science community as well as the policy community, all the way from the national level, and actually sub-national level, all the way to the global level. The second point is, when we wrote the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which I thought, I think was a superb document with about 1,300 of the best experts in the world working on it, the key issue there fundamentally was, at the end of the day, getting the economics right. At first, I think the NGO community hated it. We put their classical issue of species and genetic variations into a framework of economics. It's the best thing that we could ever do. Why? The most powerful ministers in the world are finance ministers. It doesn't matter which country in the world you go to, finance ministers are powerful, other than heads of state. Defence ministers are also fairly powerful, and so are foreign ministers. But finance ministers are incredibly powerful. And we had to make a decision. Was our document, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, going to talk to environment ministers or the sectoral ministers, including the finance? We made a decision very early on, which I think even the NGOs now appreciate. We wanted to talk to finance ministers and the energy minister, the agricultural minister, the water minister, etc. And it is, as I said in there, it doesn't matter if it's climate change, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's water. If we don't get the economics right, with the right incentive structures, we're not going anywhere. And so while there's a huge amount of work being done at the moment, and say Pavan Sukhdev working on TEEB is looking at the value of ecosystem services, and so will we in the national ecosystem. If you can't appropriate that value into the marketplace and create markets, it's still a very academic exercise. And so the challenge is first to understand the scientific issues, the natural science issues of the relationship between biodiversity and the services, then to understand the implication of those services to human well-being in both economic and non-economic terms, both market and non-market. And the next hard job is, how do you then create markets? Carbon's easy because of climate change. What about pollination services? We're losing bees and other pollinators, especially in the US, but also starting to see it here. That will be a very local market. So you can go from global markets like carbon to very local markets like pollinators.